All right, so my article is Your Morals Depend on Language. So, for background, people consider moral judgments to be the result of deep, thoughtful principle. This means moral judgments of right and wrong should be unaffected by irrelevant aspects of a moral dilemma. If somebody understands a moral dilemma, their choice of what to do shouldn't be affected by whether the dilemma is presented in a foreign or a native language. Generally, foreign language elicits a less intense emotional reaction proportionate to a native language. Research by Harris in 2004 showed that skin conductance responses as well as perceived force of emotional phrases are reduced when presented in a foreign language compared to a native language. As well as this, heuristic biases driven by emotional factors such as loss aversion are reduced when making decisions in a foreign language. This reduced emotionality could potentially promote a more reasoned, controlled decision-making process that leads to a utilitarian choice, the choice that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So this study had two separate experiments, but one overarching main hypothesis, which was that when moral judgments are presented in a foreign language, they'd be less affected by the emotional reactivity elicited by a dilemma. The first experiment in the study hypothesized that people will be more likely to opt for sacrificing one person in order to save five when dealing with this moral dilemma in a foreign language than in their native language. The second experiment had the goal of replicating these findings as well as examining some alternative explanations. So, experiment one. Experiment one examines the first specific hypothesis. So participants were collected from several populations of native and foreign language speakers. To meet the criteria for the study, participants had to be late learners of the foreign language, and they had to have sufficient proficiency to understand the instructions for the task, which was assessed through comprehension checks. And that's shown on this graph right here. So the participants were divided into their native and foreign language populations. So there was 112 English native speakers that spoke Spanish as a foreign language, 80 Korean native speakers that spoke English as a foreign language, 107 English speakers that spoke French as a foreign language, and 18 English native speakers that spoke Hebrew as a foreign language. And their written comprehension, written production, and oral comprehension were also self-rated. So for the procedure, the participants read a packet containing the moral dilemma scenario and a cartoon depiction of the scene. A footbridge version of the trolley problem was used, in which an oncoming train will kill 5 people, and the only way to stop it is to push one man off of a footbridge into the path of the train. Within each language pair group, participants were randomly assigned to either their native language or a foreign language. Participants would read the packet and then indicate their decision on what they would do, as well as answering questions on a language and demographic background, which we saw in the first table there, as well as a language comprehension check and foreign language assessment, which we also saw in that first table. So for results, here's the table of the results, which shows that more participants chose the utilitarian choice to kill the one person in order to save the other 5 when using the foreign language than in their native language. And the rate of utilitarian decisions in a foreign language increased by more than half compared to the native language, from 20 to 33% of the weighted average there. So some other interesting things to note was that none of the Korean participants in the native language condition chose to push the man. This could reflect a cultural prohibition, but as you can see, and that was examined in the next following experiment. As you can see in the table, the Hebrew and English-speaking groups showed an unusually large difference between utilitarian decisions in their native and foreign language conditions. The researchers determined that this was most likely the result of a small group size, as there was only 18 participants in the group. But overall, these results support the first specific hypothesis that people will be more likely to opt for sacrificing one person in order to save 5 when dealing with the moral dilemma in a foreign language compared with their native language. So in experiment 2, the researchers sought to replicate the effects seen in the previous experiment and evaluate two alternative explanations. The first of these was that because a foreign language is more difficult, participants are more likely to respond randomly. The researchers considered that this could be a confounding variable in relation with reduced emotional reactivity, and random response could push the proportion of utilitarian decisions upwards towards 50%. The second alternative explanation was that people may not be more utilitarian because of language, but due to cultural norms. So participants in this study, there were 397 native English speakers or native Spanish speakers with English as a foreign language, and 328 native English speakers with Spanish as a foreign language. Here is the graph or the table of the participants, and to evaluate the level to which emotional reactions are reduced when dealing with a dilemma in a foreign language, the researchers introduced a switch dilemma in which, instead of pushing a man off of the footbridge in order to save the other 5, participants would indicate whether they would pull a switch to change a trolley's direction from a track with 5 men on it to one with only 1 man on it. This problem is less emotionally reactive, as pulling a switch isn't as emotionally aversive to a person as pushing someone off of a footbridge is. So for materials, there was the footbridge and the switch problem, but they didn't have the cartoon depiction this time. The order in which the problems was presented was counterbalanced across the participants, which is critical to evaluate the cultural norms, as we've got the English and Spanish-speaking cultural norms associated with both of those languages. For procedure, the study was conducted in classrooms of 10 to 50 students of various educational backgrounds, in which all the students completed the task in the same language, and instructions were given followed by 2 dilemmas, or one of the 2 dilemmas and then the next one. So everyone did both of the dilemmas, and the session lasted for around 10 minutes. All right, results. So depending on how native the language was, participants' choices on the footbridge dilemma were considerably different. 18% of the participants decided to push the man to death when reading in their native language, and 44% chose to push the man when reading in a foreign language. These results reflect the results from the first experiment. So the first alternative explanation for the findings was examined through introducing a less emotional dilemma with the switch problem. And in general, more people tend to select the utilitarian option in the switch problem. The results show that both the native and foreign language conditions favored diverting the train. This shows that foreign language doesn't have the same effect of increasing a utilitarian choice in a less emotionally reactive situation. The researchers also examined whether a foreign language increases the tendency to respond randomly. The footbridge dilemma's results are consistent with the idea that foreign language increases the tendency to respond randomly, but the switch dilemma's results contradict this, as we can see, with an 81% rate of utilitarian choice in the native language condition of the switch dilemma. This should predict a reduction in utilitarian choice, but none is observed. This contradicts the alternative explanation that because foreign languages are difficult, participants are more likely to respond randomly. As far as the cultural explanation, the figure on the right shows that the effect of language for the footbridge dilemma was independent of the native language of the participant and of the culture associated with the language of the session. So overall, the research shows that moral judgments and decisions become more utilitarian in a foreign language and depend on the nativeness of the language in which the dilemma is presented. Cognitive fluency may contribute to the effect of foreign language on moral judgment as well. A potential explanation for this is that obtaining information in a foreign language reduces its emotional reactivity, leading to an increase in utilitarian judgments, which may promote psychological distance. As well as this, increasing proficiency in a foreign language may promote emotional grounding and evoke similar emotional reactions to that of a native language.